Right, so here we are again. A handful of boats filled with civilians, students, trade unionists, Greta Thunberg, sailing with baby formula and bandages, and Israel shaking with rage as though they were an armada of destroyers. But what terrifies Tel Aviv, just as was the case with every previous flotilla, isn't the cargo. It's the cameras, it's the flags, the audacity, the attention. It all takes away from their victim status and their propaganda, doesn't it? Every flotilla Israel brands as a terrorist plot, yet this time the supposed terrorists are parliamentarians and pensioners and activists with GoPros. But for once the usual silence has cracked here, because where the world has watched previous boats seeking to break the siege of Gaza make their way across the Med in silence, even after said boats get captured in international waters by Israel in what are blatant acts of piracy. This time 16 nations, from Spain to South Africa, Brazil to Bangladesh, have effectively declared themselves the flotilla's bodyguards. Not frigates or fighter jets, but something harder for Israel to dismiss: political cover. If Israel attacks, it won't just be Gaza under fire, but the sovereignty of half the globe, many of whom have their own citizens aboard the boats. But the question that remains when it comes to the crunch is, will these bodyguard nations hold the line? Right, so picture the scene. Dozens of ships strung out across the Mediterranean, patched together from Tunisian harbours, Spanish ports, and soon to be joined by more from Italy and the Greek islands. This is, of course, not a naval convoy, not a show of force by an empire. It's a fleet of civilians. They're students, they're trade unionists, they are parliamentarians, they are cultural figures. And yes, they carry aid, food, medicine, and essentials. But what they're carrying above all is defiance. That's what Israel hates the most. Because once more, boats are sailing across the Med to break that siege of Gaza. This is, of course, the global Sumud Flotilla, the largest civilian attempt ever launched to break Israel's siege on Gaza. And for the first time in the history of these maritime missions, they are not alone. Because while Israel has long treated these flotillas as open season, boarding, seizing, even killing without serious consequence, as was the case of the Mavi Marmara, this time the world has shifted, and not before time either. 16 sovereign states from every corner of the globe have issued a joint warning in relation to the flotilla aimed squarely at Israel. Spain, Ireland, Slovenia, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Turkey, Qatar, Oman, South Africa, Indonesia, Malaysia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, the Maldives and Libya. Together, they have declared in advance that the flotilla is civilian, that its mission is humanitarian, and that any unlawful act against it will not pass in silence but will lead to accountability. For the first time, Israel faces not just the activists themselves at sea, but a chorus of nations standing between it and its intended victims sailing their way. These states have made themselves political bodyguards, therefore, and the question is, will they act like bodyguards, if, or rather when, Israel inevitably attacks them as they have every other ship headed their way with aid? As I've mentioned in several flotilla videos that I've made now, the protection that has been missing before is highly relevant, as much as the bodyguards present this time do as well. In 2010, the Mavi Marmara set out for Gaza as part of the Freedom Flotilla coalition. It was boarded in international water by Israeli commandos, and 9 people were killed on deck. Israel spun that story as one of soldiers being lynched by violent activists, a lie that collapsed only when footage emerged of live fire against unarmed passengers. Turkey was left to rage alone, though. Expelled the Israeli ambassador as they did, they suspended military ties, and pleading for accountability at the United Nations, who wrung their hands as they do every time. Other states issued statements, but no one else truly stood up. So the lesson from that event was a brutal one, that without a coalition, Israel's impunity would hold. And it did, through flotilla after flotilla. Boats were seized quietly again in 2018, in 2020, in 2023, slightly more noisily, but still seized this year as well. Activists were detained and deported, or locked up for short periods of time, as we've seen this year, but each time the world moved on. So why now? Why this time has the script shifted then? It's partly because the ground beneath Israel has changed. The International Court of Justice has already ruled that there is a plausible case of genocide, of course, but the UN has also ruled now that there is genocide in Gaza. The images of destroyed cities, of skeletal children dying from starvation, of deliberate aid obstruction have burned into global consciousness. Israel's propaganda line that every civilian boat is a front for terrorists no longer holds water. When the world sees Greta Thunberg boarding, when politicians announce their participation, when trade unionists livestream their journey, the absurdity of branding them as Hamas operatives completely collapses. The flotilla has learned transparency is its greatest shield. Why else do they film and document absolutely everything? Journalists, proper ones, on board these vessels as well, of course. And people everywhere have taken up the cause. In Tunis, thousands rallied in Sidi Bou Said after drone strikes hit flotilla vessels in their port, denouncing what they saw as Israeli attempts at intimidation, because who else would it be? In Genoa, tens of thousands marched in solidarity, one of the largest pro-flotilla protests in Italy's history. In Barcelona, crowds thronged the waterfront as the ships departed, turning a port into a stage of defiance. Paris saw rallies with paper boats being held high. Even Naples and Mallorca joined in, demonstrations rippling out across the Mediterranean. These are not isolated gestures, they're the rear guard. Ordinary people forcing governments to take notice, insisting that this time there must be protection. And protection, astonishingly, has come. 16 nations have put their names to a document declaring the flotilla legitimate, civilian, lawful. It's worth pausing on the breadth of this. Spain, Ireland and Slovenia are all EU members, breaking the usual consensus of silence from that bloc. Brazil, Colombia and Mexico are Latin American heavyweights, with Brazil and Colombia already straining ties with Tel Aviv. Turkey has long been a critic, but this time it's joined by Qatar and Oman from the Gulf, both typically neutral mediator states, though in Qatar's case that has been blown sky high recently by that Israeli attack on Doha. Even fractured Libya has signed up to this. South Africa is already prosecuting Israel at the ICJ for genocide. Indonesia, Malaysia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, the Maldives, they all add the weight of populous Muslim majority states. So this is not one bloc we're looking at here. It's actually a patchwork shield across multiple continents. It's a group of nations that do not immediately tie together necessarily, all finding common cause around this fleet. So what does this mean for Israel to face this then? This time it has to be different, right? At the very least, it removes their plausible deniability. No one can claim, as they have done before, that Israel acted against pirates or unknown militants, a weak and washy excuse as that was before. The flotilla has been vouched for by sovereign states this time. Nationals of those states are on board, of course. An attack on the flotilla is therefore an attack not just on civilians, but on the citizens of Spain and Ireland and Brazil and South Africa and Indonesia and others whose governments have already said they will hold Israel accountable if they attack the flotilla this time. So the calculus has altered. But now, here's the grotesque absurdity at the heart of this. Israel's go-to excuse has always been the same. Every flotilla, no matter how transparent, is smeared as a terrorist front. Every sack of flour is a potential weapon. Every student activist is a smuggler. That lie worked in the shadows of 2010 and the intervening years since, perhaps to increasingly lesser extents. It worked when cameras were scarce and the narrative could be shaped after the raid, but today, with well-known figures boarding openly, with parliamentarians declaring their passage, with trade union banners flying from the decks, cameras everywhere, that propaganda won't wash this time. Are we really supposed to believe Greta Thunberg is Hamas? That MPs are hiding rockets in the food bags? That students are smuggling missiles in their backsacks? This is the grotesque overreach of Israel's excuse machine, and it's why the flotilla is so dangerous to its narrative. It unmasks the blockade for what it is, not security, but collective punishment and genocide. The scenarios ahead for the flotilla, nevertheless, are still no laughing matter. It's why this support, this guardianship from 16 nations is so important. If Israel merely harasses the flotilla, shadowing it with gunboats or issuing radio threats or perhaps firing water cannons, then we could expect diplomatic protests, couldn't we? Debates in Brussels, perhaps, resolutions at the OIC, motions at CELAC in Latin America. Spain and Ireland will push for language in the European Union, reminding Israel of its liabilities. Brazil and Colombia will use regional bodies to raise the alarm. South Africa will add the harassment to its genocide case filings. It'll be loud, but it'll be limited. And you might think this is a tame response, given how Israel has reacted already to previous flotillas, but they've never dealt with this many boats before. So I figure it's worth consideration that they might back down in their response, given how difficult they may face having to deal with so many vessels this time, though certainly they won't give in to it. If Israel goes further and boards the ships without casualties, as they have done before, as they've done this year, detaining the activists and diverting the vessels to Ashdod, well, the temperature rises again. Ambassadors could be recalled. Turkey may expel the Israeli envoy again, as it did after the Mavi Marmara. South Africa could seek emergency hearings at the ICJ. Brazil and Colombia could push sanctions. The European Union may demand the suspension of the EU-Israel Association Agreement, partially done already at this point. Ursula von der Leyen have been backed into a corner. But it could go a lot further. This many boats, just ignoring this, just won't be accepted this time. This would sting Israel diplomatically in ways it's not faced in years. The question of if they could board this many boats without a few getting through, though, is something else entirely. And if Israel were to use lethal force because they simply can't contain the flotilla, the flotilla of this size, if blood is spilled on decks again, then these bodyguards will face their ultimate test. South Africa would file new charges at the ICJ. Spain and Ireland would be under immense pressure to push the EU for sanctions, having taken leads in Europe on this as they have. We can speculate until the cows come home, ultimately, can't we? But in other words, a diplomatic earthquake, nothing less would do. But as much as I might actually call this speculation, these are moves grounded in precedent as well. Turkey did expel Israel's ambassador after 2010. South Africa has already hauled Israel before the ICJ. Colombia has already broken ties under President Gustavo Petro. Spain has recognised Palestine and pushed sanctions debates in the EU. So these governments are not making idle threats, actually. They've already acted in recent years, and in recent months as well, and may well do so again should Israel attack this flotilla which they have now placed under their wings. But there is a bitter irony in all this. It cuts deep through, and these bodyguard nations need to accept that this is on them as well. Why should a civilian aid flotilla need bodyguards at all? Why should this require a civilian aid flotilla full stop, actually? Why doesn't Spain just send ships in, or Italy, or France, or whoever, frankly? International law is explicit. Freedom of navigation in international waters is sacrosanct. Attacking unarmed civilian ships is piracy, and yet when Israel does it, the so-called rules-based order just shrugs. National vessels wouldn't get treated this way, and it's past time this needed doing. No one asked for bodyguards when international activists sailed to East Timor or South Africa under apartheid, but Palestinians must be protected from the very state that claims to be a democracy, a state that's turned the Mediterranean into a killing ground for those who dare bring baby milk instead of bullets. Would any other state in the world be allowed to drone civilian vessels in foreign harbours as Israel stands accused of doing Tunisia? Would Russia be allowed to machine gun activists on boats in the Black Sea and still be welcomed in Brussels? Would Iran be tolerated if it stormed a fleet of Western parliamentarians bringing aid to besieged civilians? Yet Israel has done all of this before and faced nothing but empty words. The flotilla and its bodyguards have exposed this double standard now for all to see, or have if you've heard about any of this, because guess where you won't find stories about this? Western mainstream media. What is at stake here is more than Gaza, though. Gaza is the beating heart of it. It's the question of whether international law has any force left in it in real time. The ICJ has ruled on genocide in Gaza, and so has the UN now. But Israel continues its genocide, now embarking on a ground invasion of Gaza City. The ICC has opened investigations, but mooted warrants against the likes of Smotrich and Ben-Gvir appear to be sat there just gathering dust. The flotilla puts the question differently. Can law protect lives at sea, not just produce judgments years later? Can a coalition of states act as bodyguards in practice, not just on paper? And if not, then what remains of the so-called international community at all? For those states, there are risks too. Spain, Ireland, and Slovenia risk isolation within the EU, where Germany and France and the UK still cling to Israel's side, though the opposite really ought to be true. Brazil and Colombia risk pressure from Washington, Colombia already facing such for very different reasons, although actually it does come back to Israel. South Africa already faces Western economic pressure for its ICJ case, but the calculus continues to shift against that. To remain silent now is worse. As activists in the Maghreb section of the flotilla have declared, silent regimes have failed us. The same message applies globally. Silence is complicity, and complicity is becoming more and more toxic. So where does that leave us then? With a test, I fancy. A test of Israel's arrogance, yes, but also a test of the bodyguards' resolve. Will they step forward if the flotilla is attacked, when as seems more likely the case, or will they melt away and their signatures on a letter actually mean nothing at all? Will international law be defended in real time this time, or only after days, weeks, months of imprisonment in filthy Israeli prisons, or, God forbid, after the funerals, if then at all? Will this be remembered as the moment Israel's impunity over its siege of Gaza began to crack, or as another betrayal of civilians who dared to defy that siege? Already the flotilla has achieved something remarkable. And I'm not talking about the scale of the flotilla this time, the largest there has ever been. But it has forced the world to choose in a way it hasn't before. Choose between solidarity and silence, between complicity and accountability, between allowing Israel to attack civilians yet again, or finally drawing a line. It's no longer just a flotilla. This is a line in the sand now, a line in the water, if you like. So the world watches as the ships sail on. The protests will continue to roar on land. The 16 nations hold their signatures aloft like a shield right now. But does it mean anything? The sea waits, and with it the verdict. 16 nations have vowed accountability, but what will they actually do when the first Israeli gunboat appears on the horizon, as it is certain to do? Of course, for as much as the flotilla aims to break the siege, the main focus right now is very much on Gaza City, that ground invasion having now begun, escalation once more by Israel in its genocide, and the world still sits and watches and does nothing, which is of course not reassuring for the flotilla's fate, but it's also not entirely going Netanyahu's way either, so get all the details of that story in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping to support the channel at the same time, which is very much appreciated, holding power to account for ordinary working class people, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers folks.